Daniel Chernilo is Professor of Sociology at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile and visiting Professor of Social and Political Thought at Loughborough University in the UK. In his talk entitled Freud's Moses and Monotheism, Right Argument at the Wrong Time, Professor Chernilo outlines 3 arguments which counter accusations that 2 of the book's main theses were a form of Jewish self-hatred.
Daniel Chernilo, you're very, very welcome to this event of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, which is held in collaboration with the Indiana Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. I'm going to let you introduce your paper yourself, which is on Moses and Monotheism and Jewish identity and anti-Semitism. And I'm going to say just again that we shared a PhD supervisor and a mentor in Robert Fine, and that is something that I think will forever be something that we have in common. There are probably other things. Daniel, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Well, hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yes, as David says, we've known each other for a long time. I lived and worked in the UK for many years now. I'm back in Chile, where I'm originally from, and I'm working on this paper for a while. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a little bit the background of the talk, and then I will read through the paper, and I have a handful of images and a couple of quotations for you to look at, and hopefully I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we can open it up for discussion. The title of the paper, it's slightly different from the one we put in the ad. This is because there were slight changes, but you will see that the paper is very much the paper is very much the same, and we'll be talking about Freud's book on Moses and the history of the reception of that book within Jewish intellectuals, and also what does it tell us about Jewish identity and anti-Semitism. So a little bit of a background. I'm a sociologist by training. I work in the field that we call social theory, and I'm not a terribly political person, but over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been involved in questions of anti-Semitism at a kind of political level here in Chile, a little bit in the UK as well, in association with David, of course. So in a way, I've been sort of I'm having to go back to questions of anti-Semitism and what does it mean to talk about anti-Semitism in contemporary society in a more political setting. And that led me to start thinking about, well, what do I really want to say, or how can I kind of reflect a little bit more deeply on what anti-Semitism is, on how it has evolved and how it has changed over the years. And in a way, that's also been a little bit of a biographical journey insofar as the question of what the Jewish identity means in contemporary society. In my case, what a secular Jewish identity means for me, and means for my family and for my surroundings. So this is a talk that grew out of kind of political and biographical concerns, but it has been moving towards a kind of more proper academic talk. And I don't know exactly how. I came across Freud's book on Moses, and I started reading it, and I found it is just such a good fun. It's so provocative, it's so insightful, it's so crazy at times that I started studying and working on it. And then I discovered that the reception of the book among Jewish intellectuals and Jewish scholars, not only Jewish, but mostly Jewish scholars, it's also a subject in itself. So in a way, this has grown organically, from political concerns, from biographical concerns, and from purely intellectual concerns. And then suddenly this kind of talk has emerged. So as I said, I will read to it, and then I'll hopefully guide you through the main arguments that Freud makes in the book and how we can use it in contemporary society. So I'll start. So Freud published anonymously an essay on Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses in 1914. This is the one you have on the screen. The figure had been commissioned to Michelangelo by Pope Julius II in the early 17th century and can still be seen in Rome in the San Pietro Basilica. Freud was in awe of the sculpture since his first visit to it in 1901 and spent long weeks looking at it over several years. When, between 1937 and 1939, Freud published in 3 different parts what became his more famous essays on the man Moses and the monotheistic religion, the only reference to his early piece was to point out that he had been interested in Moses for a very long time. The 2 essays are very different. The early one, the one on the sculpture, is half the length of the later one. The former is an interpretation of a particularly remarkable artistic achievement, whereas the latter offers a reinterpretation of those historical events that shape Judaism. The Michelangelo essay is concerned with the artist's intention in depicting Moses in this particular pose, whereas the historical essay on Moses focuses on the facts that led to the world historical consequences of the emergence of Judaism. However, there are striking similarities between the 2 texts as well. In both, Freud accepts that he's no expert in the fields he's about to enter. The history of artistic criticism in one, Egyptology on the other. The 2 books are equally written in 3 parts that have a similar structure within their argumentative structures. In part 1, he summarily surveys previous knowledge in those fields and raises doubts as to the accuracy of mainstream claims. In part 2, Freud brings to light some new facts or offers a reinterpretation of all facts in order to present his own analysis. Finally, in the last section of each piece, Freud elaborates on the general implications of his discussion. Above all, the texts share Freud's application of the psychoanalytic method to areas that are far removed from individual psyche and neurosis. For my purposes, the most relevant connection between the 2 books is found towards the end of the 1914 essay, the Michelangelo one. There, Freud mentions in passing a tension in Michelangelo's sculpture that will eventually play a central role in the essay he published a quarter of a century later. The more he looked at the statue, the more Freud came to the realization that in the past, we witnessed the presence of 2 different Moses, he says. In this interpretation, the movements in Moses' body depict 2 contradictory emotions. Moses' physical expression of anger with his people's idolatry clashes with the moral pain he feels for the Jews' unworthy behavior. One Moses is ill-tempered, the other wants to understand the people. One vents out his fury, and the other knows that he ought to control himself for the sake of a greater moral good. Freud claims that the inconsistencies in Moses' character are to be found in the biblical depiction of Moses as well. In the text he wrote in the 1930s, the intuition that Michelangelo is depicting 2 sides of Moses takes on a whole new meaning, as Freud now will say that we are talking about 2 different persons who lived in 2 different times and places. So in what follows, I start by retelling the version of the biblical story of Moses, as how Freud tells it in the 1939 book, and then connect it to wider debate on secular Jewish life in the modern world. In the 3rd part, I use Freud's argument to look at the question of the fundamentally hybrid character of Jewish identity, and finally, on the pervasive dimension of anti-Semitism within modern culture. So, what is the story that Freud tells us? The starting point of Freud's narration is that Moses was a real historical character who lived around the 14th century BC in Egypt. At the time, under the rule of the 18th pharaonic dynasty, Egypt had become a world empire. Around 1375 BCE, the pharaoh Amenhotep IV pushed for a series of religious reforms that are considered the early expressions of monotheism. While formally maintaining the Egyptian tradition of worshipping the sun, the attempt was made to turn the sun into a pure symbol, an abstract force, rather than focusing on it as an element in the natural world. The new faith thus established centered on the cult of a new god, the god Aton, that never became genuinely popular in Egypt. In fact, these reforms were so radical that they eventually became seen as heresy, and a civil war ensued. In anger, Amenhotep, the pharaoh, changed his name to Akhenaten or Ignaton, and founded even a new capital city for the empire that he named after himself, Akhenaton. The Aton experiment was short-lived, however, and soon after Akhenaten's death, normal cultic practices resumed in Egypt. According to Freud's reconstruction, Moses was an Egyptian follower of Ignaton, who, after the death of the pharaoh, decided to continue with his radical monotheistic cult. Moses was most likely a disenchanted priest who was prepared to do anything to carry forward the Aton faith. Freud acknowledges that he was not the first to claim that Moses was an Egyptian, but the question remains, whence comes the legend and indeed the cult devoted to him as a particularly Jewish hero? It is one thing to claim that Moses was an Egyptian, something other for him to be regarded, as Freud does, as the creator of the Jewish people. Freud then notices that there is something unusual in the narrative structure of the biblical story of Moses. In most myths of a similar kind, Sargon of Agade, Cyrus, Romulus, and indeed Oedipus himself, the hero is of noble origins, but external circumstances made him grow up in humble surroundings. Yet in the case of Moses, the story works the other way around. He was a humble Jewish boy who was raised by a noble Egyptian family, and Moses came back to his people as a liberator only much later in life. If Freud were to decipher the historical truth behind the story of Moses, it was necessary to find the explanation behind this inversion. The first clue, Freud says, is that as Akhenaten had transformed Egyptian polytheism into a monotheistic cult, the establishment of Judaism as a religion can no longer be understood as a rejection of Egyptian culture. Rather, the opposite, says Freud, Judaism would be deeply rooted in it. Both religions share the belief in the existence of one single God, the denial of any form of afterlife, and above all, the adoption of the Egyptian practice of circumcision. If the two religions are not opposite, but are closely related, then Freud thinks he has offered the first clue towards the idea that Judaism was created by this Egyptian Moses. Freud then seeks to situate Moses in the Old Old Testament story of the Exodus. He dates these events for the period between 1350 and 1215 BC, and bases this assumption on historical records that speak of a period of anarchy in Egypt around that time, as this would have allowed for the escape of Moses' slaves. Crucially, he claimed that this is also the time when a most faithful encounter occurred between two tribes, the one who had been led by Moses out of Egypt, and a group of worshippers of the volcano god Yahweh, as it was common among Midianite peoples in the eastern Sinai and the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. Freud claims that the establishment of the Jewish people took place through the meeting of these two different tribes. A momentous finding is that this Midianite tribe had his own leader, who went also by the name of Moses. And this is Freud's first discovery. I'm quoting Freud here. We cannot escape the impression that this Moses of Cades and Midian is quite a different person from the august Egyptian we had deduced. A religion in which all magic and sorcery were most strictly abhorred. We are justified in separating the two persons from each other and in assuming that the Egyptian Moses was never in Cades and had never heard of the name Yahweh, whereas the Midianite Moses never set foot in Egypt and knew nothing of Aton. In order to make the two people into one, tradition or legend had to bring the Egyptian Moses to Midian. So the two historical Moses have nothing in common, they never met, and the stories combine in what eventually became the syncretic Old Testament Moses, who was then made the founder of the Jewish people and their religion. But this event had a far more momentous consequences. It led to the reappearance of a traumatic event that had remained repressed for the Jews who had come out of Egypt. These Jews had done something fundamentally unforgiving, a deed so terrible that no people could ever talk openly about it. Although at first they trusted Moses to deliver them out of Egypt, the Hebrews failed to live up to the high moral standards of the new religion. They grew restless as the promise of a fertile land failed to materialize. And it was then, claims Freud, that Moses met with the same fate as Ignaton. I'm reading from the screen now. The fate that awaits all enlightened despots. The Jewish people of Moses were quite as unable to bear such a highly spiritualized religion, to find in what it offered satisfaction for their needs, as were the Egyptians of the 18th dynasty. In both cases, the same thing happened. Those who felt themselves dispossessed, revolted, and threw off the burden of a religion that had been forced on them. But while the tame Egyptians waited until the fate had removed the sacred person of the Pharaoh, and this is Freud at its most, at his hardest, the savage Semites took their destiny in their own hands and did away with their tyrant. The Hebrews rebelled against Moses, killed him, and then through guilt, shame, and repression found ways to erase, to forget their magnitude. Their crime was so despicable that they could not but repent. So the more the people who killed Moses tried to hide their deed, the more they became invested in the memory of their hero and their liberator. Eventually, they even naturalized Moses. It was only the fortuitous encounter between the two tribes, the appearance of this Midianite Moses, and the syncretic creation of a new religious cult that made it possible for a nobler version of the Jewish people's founding myth to emerge. Freud says that the mystery of the inversion of the Moses story has now been solved. As most myths of its kind, Moses was in fact of noble origins and found fulfillment to his life's mission by reaching out to the weak, the oppressed, and the poor. He led the Hebrews out of serfdom, but was then betrayed and killed by his newly adopted people. The heinous crime had to be redeemed, and so the Jews erased the real foreign origins of Moses. Over time, a more acceptable version of the story took shape. Moses was not only a humble Jew, but their very founder. So this is a summary of Freud's text. So let me now start unpacking some of the story behind the book and the reception of it. By the time Freud started working on his Moses and Monotheism, he was in his late 70s and had been diagnosed with cancer for well over a decade. Hitler was already in power in Germany, and the book was only completed and published in its definitive book format after his escape to London as the Nazis annexed Austria. Freud died soon before the publication of the book in 1939. This book offered the most systematic treatment of Jewish themes among Freud's writings. Beyond his personal relationship with Judaism, the Moses offered Freud to a radical Christian, similar to the work done in Totem and Taboo, for example. Judaism's unique place among world religions had to do with it being the original incarnation, a real historic instantiation of the otherwise mythical parasite that is the founding moment of all social life. Yet we shall also see that Freud's reflection on Judaism ran deeper than its religious roots. Freud struggled with the insight that being Jewish, and above else, Jewish in the modern world, is never only about religion. In fact, I would like to argue that the misinterpretations that his book originated may be explained by that very difficulty. There must be something to being Jewish, beyond, in addition to religion. In the book that inaugurated the contemporary reception of Freud's Moses, the Jewish-American historian Yosef Hatim Yerushalmi raises a fundamental paradox of Freud's personal relationship with Judaism. Freud belonged to a generation of Jews who have severed most, if not all, ties to the beliefs, practices, and rites of the Jewish religion. And nonetheless, they all felt that there was still something fundamentally Jewish in their personal identities. At the same time as they were unable to define positively what exactly was it that made them Jewish, they refused to concede that the end of Judaism was in sight. In partial homage to Freud himself, Yerushalmi coins the idea of a psychological Jew to underscore a constitutive tension behind the rise of a modern Jewish identity. Given that much of the traditional substance of Judaism is attached to religiosity, a Jewish secular identity has become almost pure subjectivity, he says. Content is replaced by character. Alienated from classical texts, psychological Jews, modern secular Jews, tend to insist on inalienable intellectuality and independence of mind, the highest ethical and moral standards, concerns for social justice, tenacity in the face of persecution. These are among the qualities they will claim is called upon as quintessentially Jewish. Psychological Jews are Jews for whom there is something backward in traditional Judaism, but are unable to posit positively what is Judaism beyond religion. They have sympathy for, but are not fully committed to Zionism, and despite all this, cannot but see themselves as fundamentally Jewish. This reminded me of Isaac Deutscher's idea of the non-Jewish Jew as an archetype of the modern intellectual who has fundamentally reshaped modern culture. And this is Deutscher. If it's not a race, what then makes a Jew? Religion, I'm an atheist. Jewish nationalism, I'm an internationalist. In neither sense I am, therefore, a Jew. I am, however, a Jew by force of my unconditional solidarity with the persecuted and the exterminated. I am a Jew because I feel the Jewish tragedy as my own tragedy, because I feel the pulse of Jewish history, because I should like to do all I can to assure the real, not the spurious, security and self-respect of the Jews. It seems to me that the difficulties in accepting Freud's attempt at redefining Judaism beyond religion may account for the negative reception of his Moses book among leading Jewish intellectuals. So let me briefly show you a handful of them. In the 1940s, Martin Buber wrote his own book on Moses, and he dismissed Freud's work in the first footnote of the preface to the book. So Buber had nothing good to say about Freud's book and just put the following footnote, the one above in the slide, that a scholar of so much importance in his own field as Sigmund Freud could permit himself to issue so unscientific a work based on groundless hypotheses as his Moses and Monotheism is just regrettable. Never again in his own work does Buber mention Freud again, and yet his own Moses cannot but be read as a repudiation of Freud books. To Buber, Jewish life is completely autonomous, owes nothing to Egyptian culture, and Moses is depicted in Buber's portrayal as the social leader of a theocratic regime. In the 1950s, Leo Straus delivered a lecture on Freud's Moses and found little in it that deserved his approval. Freud's secularism fundamentally skewed his understanding of religion in general and of Judaism in particular. Straus can hardly conceal his anger when he writes, and that's the second quotation you have there, on the basis of Freud's suggestion, the situation of the Jews in regard to Moses is identical to the situation of the Gentiles, and hence, in particular, of the German in regard to Jesus. At the moment of the complete collapse of assimilation of Jews to Germans, Freud commits the ultimate act of assimilation. He assimilates the situation of the Jews in regard to Moses with the situation of the Germans in regards to Jesus. This is the 1950s. In the 1970s, Hans Blumenberg also wrote about Freud's Moses, but funnily enough, decided not to publish his essay while he was alive. In its English translation, which came out in 2018, Blumenberg's piece on Freud appears alongside another essay, one on Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. The two texts belong together because Blumenberg took issue with the decision of publishing such works at critical historical junctures for Jewish history. Freud's accusation of Jewish parricide while the Nuremberg laws were in full swing. Arendt's belittling of Eichmann's role during the Holocaust, precisely at the time when, thanks to the State of Israel, were at last able to confront the crimes of the final solution from a position of strength. To Blumenberg, Freud's claim that he was concerned with historical truth alone, and Arendt's idea that she lacked love for the Jewish people, are equally disingenuous. They are narcissistic, and they exaggerate their own self-importance. The main charge against Freud, therefore, is that he betrayed the Jews at their most critical time. If the founder of the Jews was an Egyptian, and if their main contribution to civilization, monotheism, is also foreign, then the only possible conclusion appears to be that the Jews are indeed parasites that feed off other people. Freud would have indulged both in self-denial. If Moses wasn't Jewish, then the Jews themselves are nothing but an invention, and even worse, self-hatred. If the Jews killed Moses, then the misery that is inflicted upon them becomes somewhat deserved. So now I want to unpack these questions a little bit more and say something about Jewish identity and anti-Semitism in the context of the reception of the work. Understandable as they are, I think these reactions don't do justice to Freud's most interesting insight. I should like to argue instead that in delving into the historical roots of Judaism, Freud uncovered a fundamental fact of how Jewish identity relates to broader society. Jewish identity, in Freud's eyes, is fundamentally hybrid, its origins being a unique combination of different traditions, practices, and creeds. The way I read it, Freud's main argument is that it is this dynamic syncretism, rather than any kind of Jewish particularism or exclusivism, that remains central to any forward-looking idea of Jewish identity. Freud's argument on what defines Jewish identity is, to my mind, the positive one. Its key cultural marker is the continuous change and evolution of its own hybridity. The key facts that constitute the early religious identity of the Jews are, on the one hand, that the founder of the Jewish people was an Egyptian, and on the other, that the Jewish religion itself arose as a combination of the Egyptian god Adon and the Midianite god Yahweh. Freud's counter-narrative is that the Jewish way of life is nothing but the coming together of a diversity of tradition, practices, and influence. The Jewish religion's gift to the world, that's an expression Freud uses in the book, is that of having put together, though not created or invented by themselves, the idea of a universal God that knows not of man or woman, black or white, Jew or Gentile, but only of human beings. Freud may have been reflecting on his own Jewishness, in large part at least, in how his own Jewishness, in large part at least, was defined by contradicting some of the main tenets of how Judaism presents itself to the world, a stubborn people who has proved unable and unwilling to change, a people whose one and only loyalty is to upholding God's laws without change and without exception. Freud's critique of traditional Judaism might then have to do with its attempt to freeze it in time, while the genuine core of any Jewish identity may lie in its diversity and ability to make different worlds converse. Always living in the diaspora and in the midst of different peoples, cultures, and religions, the one permanent feature of Judaism is that it doesn't sit still, that is never equal to itself. Can there be anything more Jewish and hybrid than Yiddish or Ladino? This is how Deutscher makes the argument again. Those who live on the borderlines of various civilizations comprehended more clearly the great movement and the great contradictoriness of nature and society. The definition of a Jew is so elusive precisely because the diaspora exposed the Jew to such a tremendous variety of pressures and influences. In modern times, this hybrid conception of Jewish identity is available in both a positive and a negative register. On the positive side, it is found in those transformations of Jewish life that can be traced back to Mendelssohn and his Haskalah movement in the late 18th century. The renovation of Jewish spiritual life in consonance with the humanistic, scientific, and more politically progressive side of the Enlightenment. These were Jews who wanted to remain Jew, but whose everyday life had already pushed them beyond an exclusively Jewish life. Jews for whom the ability to live in two worlds at the same time was perceived, or at the very least could be imagined, as a unique advantage of their social position. But there is also a reactive, often negative attitude against the modern redefinition of Jewish identity along hybrid lines. With greater intensity after the rise of Zionism in the last third of the 19th century, a more mixed conception of Jewish culture found opposition in different Jewish quarters. Orthodox Jews, proponents of full assimilation, and Jewish nationalists found very different answers to what they saw as the same underlying challenge facing modern Jews. The spiritual integrity, a long-term political viability of Jewish life was fundamentally challenged by this hybridity. To them, modern Jewish life faces a tragic choice. Jews can remain Jews in a traditional sense by tying themselves to orthodoxy more firmly than ever before. They can abandon Judaism altogether and embrace the struggle for full integration into mainstream national society, or they can modernize Jewish identity by creating a state of their own and turning the Jews into a nation like any other. It seems to me that by making Moses an Egyptian, Freud was not betraying his people during those times when they needed him the most. On the contrary, his hybrid conception of Jewish cultural life is an affirmative political act against their current persecution. No ethnic or racial definition of the Jews can ever work because they have never led the life of an isolated people whose only contact with the outside world is of a parasitic nature. Jews cannot be separated out from their host societies without both being deprived of something fundamental of their common existence. To my mind, Freud's message to the Jews in his Moses was this: we will survive these trying times, not only because our forebears have already done so many times before, but because there just isn't one thing alone that our persecutors can take away from us. There is no essential feature of Jewish identity whose disappearance may trigger the path to the extinction of Jewish life. Not even attempts at the physical extermination of the Jews would work, because whatever element anyone may think as essentially Jewish, it is always already a mixture of both Jewish and non-Jewish components. I'm getting to the beginning of the end, and now I want to say a little bit about anti-Semitism. The hybrid dynamism with which Freud endows Jewish identity through the ages finds its opposite in Freud's reactive argument on the obstinacy of anti-Semitism in Western culture. In his Moses, Freud offers a rather essentialist view on the causes of anti-Semitism. There is something fundamentally negative in Freud's view on the pervasiveness and intractability of anti-Semitism, regardless of time, place, and culture. Indeed, commentators have often picked up on Freud's rather twisted intuition that it's somehow the Jews' own fault that they have attracted this undying hatred. In the word of Elisabeth Roudinescu, who is a French psychoanalyst and philosopher, he makes the following argument in relation particularly to Freud. The Jewish people insist on denying the murder of God, and Christians never stop accusing the Jews of being deicides because they freed themselves from the original fall. Since Christ, as a substitute for Moses, sacrificed his life to redeem them. If Christianity is a religion of the Son, who confesses his murder and redeems it, Judaism remains a religion of the Father, which refuses to acknowledge the murder of God. And the Jews are still persecuted for the murder of the Son, of which they're innocent. Freud concluded that this refusal exposed the Jews to resentment of all the people. Freud appears to give up on the possibility of understanding empirically the changes, causes, and circumstances that contribute to the recurrence of anti-Semitism. As he reflected on the biblical, the theological, the historical, and even the psychoanalytical causes of anti-Semitism, Freud appears unable to offer an adequate explanation of it, in what I think is the weakest argument of his book. Freud ultimately says that the causes of anti-Semitism lie outside history. Anti-Semitism is so deeply ingrained in Western life that Jews can only resign themselves to its obduracy. This essentialist account of anti-Jewish sentiments, Freud just justified on the ground that parricide is the fundamental crime on which all civilizations are founded. The primal patricide of the horde is not a symbolic event, but a real one. It is the very moment when history starts. The truth of religion with regard to the human spirit lies in the fact that the original killing of the father, they take place. The Jews are universally hated because they are the one who effectuated the most heinous crime. And the wider significance of the Moses story lies in how it delineates the main cultural framework of Western civilizations. The Jews' continuous denial of their patricide explain why they rejected and betrayed Jesus, which in turn makes it all but inevitable that Jew hatred had become a defining feature of the West. Their negation of the crime just adds insult to injury. They can't be trusted. They can't be trusted because they have such a big secret to hide. The universal persecution that has followed them is the price the Jews are constantly asked to pay for having given birth to human civilization. This argument also allows Freud to explain the symbolically negative position that Jews consistently attract in different milieux. For Egyptian antiquity, the Jews represent idolatry and paganism. For Christians, they are apostasy and the obstinacy of rejecting the Messiah. For the nationalist, they represent the enemy within. For the capitalist, they are the embodiment of socialism, as much as they are quintessentially capitalistic for socialist radicals. The Christian Judeophobia of the Middle Ages, the racist anti-Semitism of modern time, and so much contemporary anti-Zionist rhetoric differ in their conceptual underpinnings. One is couched in a theological language, the other is rooted in scientific and nationalistic discourse, and the final one belongs in the anti-imperialist ideology of the New Left. But they mirror each other insofar as they are able to give contemporary cultural currency to the universality of Jewish hate. To Freud, what unites these discourses is more significant than what separates them. Indeed, they are essentially the same. The Jews were born within an Egyptian Orient that preceded them, were never able to achieve lasting political sovereignty in antiquity, and then had to contend with the right of a Christian West all around them. Eternally nomadic, cosmopolitan by nature, they also became an anomaly in a modern world of nations. As such, they cannot but be portrayed and defined by their negative traits: slaves, heretics, obdurate, duplicitous, parasites, internal enemies. A purely scientific argument on the origins of anti-Semitism is inadequate because the intensity of the hatred the Jews generate cannot be accounted for on biological grounds. The obduracy and ubiquity of anti-Semitism requires that we account for sources that run at a much deeper level. This is why, to Freud, anti-Semitism must lie outside history. Modern, secular, race-based anti-Semitism is nothing more than the recent sublation, the Aufhebung in the old language of dialectics, of the wider theological elements that lie underneath the foundations of Western culture. Given that the antipathy towards Jews never fails to surface in all sorts of times and places, anti-Semitism becomes a transcultural actualization of the death principle. Problematic as this explanation actually is, Freud's Moses is not, however, an act of Jewish self-hate. He's not turning his back on fellow Jews, nor is he blaming them for their own misery. Making the Jews to assassin Moses was Freud's way to explain the causes of the universality of the hatred they attract. If this animosity is a consequence of who they are, rather than a result of what they do, Freud is in fact exculpating real Jews for the penuries they have suffered through the ages. Yet the cost of this universal exoneration is paid at the price of giving up on the possibility of explaining sociologically and historically the causes of anti-Semitism. Two closing remarks. Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism is a fascinating book with an even more fascinating reception history. Contrary to some mainstreams during readings of this book, it seems to me this is Freud's attempt to express solidarity with, rather than abandon, the Jews at that horrible time. He is also grappling with what has remained a key question for secular Jewish life. What is to be Jewish beyond religion and around nationalism? The way I read it, the message Freud has for fellow Jews is that there is little they could have done over 2 millennia to overcome the hatred they have attracted and the persecutions they have had to endure. Its causes run at the deepest level of cultural civilization. They belong to humanity's unconscious, to the guilt and shame that lies at the bottom of Western civilization's parasite. His anxiety is real, but he doesn't wholly despair. As a universal scapegoat of the world's ill, the next tragedy may well be around the corner. And yet, whatever is thrown at them, the Jews will survive because this is who they are. Their hybrid cultural identity often places them in an awkward position vis-a-vis the cultural milieu within which they live. They are always partly alien and partly local, partly us and partly them. They are envied and admired, permanently needed, but never genuinely welcome. Yet there is also a fundamental lack of agency in Freud's account. If Jewish hatred has the essential features he claimed it has, the conclusion is that Jews can do little to combat its underlying causes. The creative difficulty of Freud Moses lies in the juxtaposition between his essentialist understanding of anti-Semitism and the claim that Jewish identity is fundamentally historical. Its ultimate paradox is that all the fluidity, creativity, and hybridity that he sees as the defining feature of Jewish identity end up being reversed by the constancy of the negative sentiments Jews universally invite. Thank you very much.
Wow. Daniel, thank you very, very much. So much in that talk. I'm trying to let it filter through a little bit for myself. I'm also aware that when you speak, you want a little break before people start asking questions and coming straight back and demanding that you work. Your work continues. I think there was a hand up. Did I miss a hand up? There was a hand up. Oh, maybe there was not a hand up, or maybe it went down again. Let me throw the floor open for questions. Encourage people to be fairly brief and sharp. And let's get our teeth into some of that material, I think. I was thinking, Daniel, about oh, I will save that for a moment and I will ask you Susan Greenberg's question, which is, hang on, give me a sec and I will read it out for people. Could you explain more about the accusation of denying the murder of God?
Yes, well, I suppose I can a little bit. I mean, Freud here is sort of treading on various arguments. And of course, he's very much aware that in mainstream Christian theology, that the Jews were the murderers of God. It was a major anti-Semitic trope through the ages. And the inability, the unwillingness of the Jews to accept that this is what they had done is central to the negative portrayal within Christianity of the kind of, horrible role of everything Jewish has within Western society. And what Freud is saying, there is something there is something else going on here, he says. Because this accusation is somehow built on a much more complex story, which is the story that the Jews did this horrible thing to Moses. So and this is why the accusation of Jewish self-hate can be put on Freud's plate, because he said we spent centuries, millennia, trying to defend ourselves that we didn't kill God, and they don't believe us. And now you're telling them that this comes from much earlier, that we killed our own father, And then we denied that we did this and created a myth, a whole myth around him, so that we can exculpate for this crime. But I think Freud's argument is kind of in a twisted kind of way. It's the opposite. It's saying this whole the Jews killed God thing is nonsense. Because the only real crime that gives birth to civilization is the killing of the father. This is nothing to do with Judaism. This is kind of Freud theory of culture. The main theory of culture in Freud is that the brothers and the siblings and the children compete for the love of the mother by killing the father. This is Oedipus. So he says, the Jews are hated not because they kill God, because they give birth to civilized life. Why? Because they took on the father and decided to organize life without him. So he's kind of saying the accusation of having killed God is nonsense, because the genuine origin of social life lies much earlier, in a much more fundamental anthropological event, when the siblings get together and kill the father. So it's kind of twisting the argument. So it's no coincidence, to my mind, and this has been a difficult kind of detective work because there are not that many references, funnily enough, why writers like Arendt, like the writers in the Frankfurt School, Eric Fromm, Buber, or Leo Straus, they all hated Freud's book. They found it horrible. They find it completely nuts and bananas, and it's just betraying the Jews, and so making, giving everything, a ready-made, what's the expression, a ready-made meal to the anti-Semites. They're giving it the whole case from no other than Freud himself. And he say, no. The thing is much more complex. We need to kind of give it another twist. That's the way I'm trying to read it. I don't know if I answered, but.
We have a question. I'm just wondering actually if that can be related to the kind of rather simplistic accusations made against Hannah Arendt, which are similar.
Well, Arendt had no time for Freud, as an aside. So they didn't really see eye to eye. But again, it seems to me that it's no coincidence that they are trying to find and trying to understand how does anti-Semitism actually work. And I think to that extent, Arendt's argument is much more sophisticated than Freud. I think Freud falls for this kind of essentialism that anti-Semitism is everywhere and there's nothing you can do about it, whereas Arendt shows it much more concretely in relation to imperialism, in relation to nationalism. But on the flip side of that, I think Freud does convey very rich sense of Jewish identity is really rather complex, rather nuanced, rather varied in so many, in such a complex kind of way. And I suppose Arendt tends to fall for a kind of much more kind of Central European high culture kind of notion of Jewish identity and Jewish life. So I suppose to that extent, Freud is much more kind of subtle in his understanding that kind of, the everydayness of Jewish culture. I've been reading Simon Schama's book on the history of the Jews, and what I took from it is that this is really the argument he makes. He says everywhere they go, they embed in society, and something new comes up out of the relationship between Jews and wherever they happen to be living in. It doesn't matter. It's Rome, it's Santiago, it's Baghdad, it's Egypt. It doesn't matter. There is always something new, something hybrid, something completely unprecedented. And I suppose Arendt doesn't really have a knife for that. So I suppose I will connect them in that kind of way, David. I suppose I'm much more taken by Arendt's reading and understanding of anti-Semitism, and I suppose I'm more sympathetic to Freud's the kind of creativity, the kind of vital energy behind his depiction of this sort of unruly Jewish life. I like.
Let me go to Rosine. How do I say your name?
Rosine.
Rosine.
Harrelberg. I wasn't planning to speak, but first of all, Daniel, thank you very much for your paper. I'm afraid I'm a psychoanalyst as well as an anthropologist in my background. And my reading of Moses and Monotheism differs from yours quite a lot. I was very interested in your talk, because I just published a paper in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis that it's called The Murder of the Dead Father, the Shoah and Contemporary Antisemitism, where I have perhaps an opposite view from you in some aspects, because the quotation you made from Rudinis Co. is a transformation of a quotation by Freud himself. Yes. Because what Freud says in Moses and Monotheism is that if Judaism is the religion of the father, Christianity is the religion of the son. And I think it's very difficult to read the text without following Freud's whole work on the notion of the father, that starts in studies of hysteria, the interpretation of dreams, and group psychology. And I think Moses and Monotheism is the culmination of his analysis of the role of the father. And I think in my paper, my suggestion is exactly that it's the murder of the father. Antisemitism is the murder of the father. And in that sense, there is an intrinsic link between totem and taboo and Moses and Monotheism, is the way in which the siblings bundle together to kill the father and put the son in their place. So I think it's a very complex paper. And I think it's actually, in my own paper, I make it a very important key for the understanding of universal anti-Semitism throughout history. So I just wanted to invite you to think about it again in a different light.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate the talk. I'm following this new organization. And I'm a friend and supportive and very, very interested to contribute to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll definitely look up the paper. Mine is under review, so we'll see if it gets published or not. I'll keep my fingers crossed. But as far as I can tell,
it's volume 5 of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. It's already available online on PEP Web. Do you have PEP Web? It's there. Anyway,
just a very brief reaction. I think to a large extent, from what I've understood, we agree. I think the centrality of Jewish hatred in Western civilization has to do with the fact that they are the original tribe who killed the father. So yeah. It's on the Jews that they have to burden the blame for that.
Well, they're killing, but in the way you're speaking at times, it felt as if you're thinking that we killed the father, whereas I think anti-Semitism in my analysis is actually the killing of the father. Unfortunately, as a psychoanalyst, I had to link it to the Oedipus complex, where the son takes the place of the father.
Do I dare to intervene? But isn't the point about Freud that everybody kills their father?
But not in reality. Freud did it in his dreams.
No, so then you have the denial that everybody wants to kill their father, everybody denies killing their father, nobody actually kills their father, and that's how
it's projected. It's projected onto the Jews, yes.
Yeah, I'll read it with real interest. Thank you so much.
And incidentally, then doesn't every father also want to kill his son? Or is that just me?
Well,
No.
you know, in my paper, I link it to the Abraham story. So, you know, which I think is a founding story, an important one. So, anyway, but because that father does not kill the son.
Yes, but again, in this, neither do the Jews kill their father. It's a close.
It's a false accusation. Anyway, I'll leave to place to others.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a feeling that Freud does believe that the Jews killed their father. That's the way I read it. It's precisely the problem.
Let me bring in Rosin, feel free to come back on that. I have a think. Let me bring in a question from the chat about supersessionism. So supersessionism is, do you want to, I don't know who that is. Do you want to ask a question or leave it in the chat in that way? So supersessionism is the idea that Christianity in the first place and then Islam are kind of improvements upon Judaism, that they supersede it, and that they are more a step along the road towards the universal, right? I think, which has always seemed to me an anxiety about the fact that the Jews might be older or more authentic than us.
That's super interesting, because I suppose it's yes and no, because absolutely yes, insofar as this central role of parricide, at the foundation of culture. But on the other hand, it's equally important for Freud that Judaism is an Egyptian product. So there is no kind of authentic, essential Jewish core that it's completely, self-evolving, endogenous, completely autonomous. The Jewish life emerged within a context, is part of this mixture that takes place within Egyptian civilization. So this, I would say that this idea of authenticity is something that Freud will be rather skeptical about. So yes, insofar as the argument of the origins of the centrality of Judaism, the symbolic centrality of Judaism in Western culture because of the parricide, but no in relation to the idea that there is a authentic Jewish core of cultural identity that kind of unfolds from the inside out.
So it's an anxiety.
What he's not saying, I suppose.
It's an anxiety about authenticity, because of course nothing is ever authentic, right? Authenticity is simply an anxiety, isn't it?
But then that's a point that Buber makes very strongly. No. Moses is 100% Jewish, and Jewish life is something completely unique, completely separate, completely distinctive. You see, they're really trying to hammer down this idea of the kosher, 100% kosher Jewish hero. And Freud say, well, it doesn't exist anyway. So yeah, it's a fair point. It's the anxiety about authenticity. I take the point. Yes.
Susan again says, at present there seems to be an especial fury at Jews for being, quotes, first. Hence all the efforts to say that present day Jews are not the real Jews. Again, the whole the whole Khazar myth is all again about a sort of challenge to authenticity, as though if you challenged Jewish authenticity, then Jews would cease to exist, which perhaps is precisely your point about the essence of Judaism, of Jewishness being that it is socially constructed and located in every different place and every different complexity. So again, the search for authenticity, for the chazars or whatever it is we're searching for, is already a kind of quite un-Jewish notion.
Yeah, I'll argue along those lines. I think, and Susan also mentioned Edward Said there. Yeah, Said has a book on the Moses, and it's a rather essentialist book because it says, oh, Freud fails to discuss the non-European and the position of the Palestinian within Jewish culture. So he's, of course, it's a brilliant book, as Said writes brilliant books, but the substantive thesis is, to my mind, a bit too embedded in the Israel-Palestine conflict and not enough on the question of what constitutes a cultural identity and an ethnic identity. And I think he plays too much on the opposition between the European and the non-European, and how the Jews kind of progressively become European, and as as they become more Europeans, they can exercise their power over the real non-Europeans, who are now the Palestinians. So I don't think it's best work, but there is a whole genre of books about Freud's book. I mean, it's a paper in itself. Just as an anecdote, Thomas Mann wrote Joseph and His Brothers. It's a huge novel, sort of 1,500 pages long. It's four different novels, and he published them in the 1930s, and the last volume in 1946 or 7. And it's very much a conversation with Freud. They are both retelling stories of the Bible. Mann is retelling the story of Jacob and Joseph. Freud is retelling the story of Moses. And they are grappling with this question that, okay, we know that the Old Testament is a very old book. It has created loads of myths, and it's a source of inspiration and for religious devotion. But how can we read it in contemporary society? So when Freud started working on this book, he thinks he's writing, he called it an historical novel along the lines of Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers. It's a kind of work of historical fiction. So he's combining genres as a way of, nowadays we would say kind of intertextuality. So how texts are written about other texts. So you can read Thomas Mann in conversing with Freud about how myths are created. Why is it that the Bible chooses to tell us some things but not others? Who interpolated what and when, so that the stories that have come down to us took the shape that they did? So there are a lot of kind of interesting and very kind of rich literature around the book, which I'm also trying to kind of put together somehow.
I'm going to just give one more opportunity for people to ask a question or to say something. And while I'm doing that, I will offer you this link, which is the link to the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism's whole collaborative seminar series with the Indiana Institute. And you will see that we already have our first lecture that was a few weeks ago with Alvin Rosenfeld. We already have a link to the video from the web page, which is quite exciting, so that people can look at it and think, oh, I'd like to see that talk, and then realize that they're too late, and then realize that it's there at the click of a button. So we will try and keep up with that. If there are no other questions or interventions, I will give you one more link, which is the obligatory asking you for a donation. the London Centre does not have any institutional or any other kind of funding, and these events are free of charge, and we would like to keep it that way. So please, if people would like to give a donation that they think is worthy of the ticket price for today, or to make a regular donation to become part of the community of support for the London Centre, then that would make us very happy. And if there's no other questions, I want to warmly thank Daniel for that talk. I think it was a very rich and really interesting talk. It was a very scholarly talk, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to host that. And also, it does occur to me that you know, we all became familiar with Zoom through the COVID pandemic, but it's extraordinary that we have a collaborative series with Indiana, and Daniel is down there in the south near the Penguins, and that we can get together and we can do serious discussions about really quite niche topics, and I think it's incredible. So thank you very much to Daniel. Thank you very much for everybody for participating, and please keep in touch with the London Centre, and we hope in the spring to bring a collaborative seminar series which will be more than just ourselves and Indiana, but will include other institutions all over the place, and hopefully one or two from Santiago too, if Daniel has in mind anything that he wants to organise. So thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.